Greetings, Kerbonauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 5 of Operation Goldstrike. And today, we ironically need to launch a refueling vessel up to our space station. The problem is, in the other episode where I launched my orange tank up, I had intended to put a little fuel in there, but instead had launched it completely empty. And if I had put some fuel in there, we'd have enough to get over to Minmus and circularize once we're there, but as it is, we do not. So I have created a new resource transfer vehicle, and that's what we're launching here. The remaining tasks of this operation, after of course the refueling right here, is we'll have to transfer the Kessler Serenity 2 over to Minmus, get it in an orbit there where we'll then send over an ore ferry craft, which will go down to the surface, gather up the ore we've collected, bring it to the station, and have it refined. After that, we need to show it being used, because after all, that's what this whole thing has been about, right? In one of my tutorials, I show how I generally will do a ground-to-station direct rendezvous. I'll be showing that again in this one, but only for a few seconds, so don't blink. Once you get just partway up in your orbit, your suborbital, you go out with the engines off, create a maneuver, pull mostly prograde with a little bit of radial up, adjust the inclination if necessary, and figure out what the rendezvous is right from here, then go back, reactivate the engines and rendezvous. Ooh, now check this out. Are you seeing anything unusual about the way that my fairing separated? Well, it just so happens there is a new mod out. For me, it was just 2 days ago. For you, it's going to be a few weeks old. It's called Stock Clamshell Fairings by Evil Reaper. So if you don't like the way that the old fairings separate, breaking up into a bunch of confetti, then you can get this one, and your fairings will now separate in clamshell form. Although a nice feature it could still add would be to make it be less parts of a clamshell. If I want a clamshell, I want 2 pieces, not 6. But still, this is a great start, and I love this. You won't need this mod to fly my craft like everything else in this project. If you don't have the same plugins I have, it'll still all work just fine for you, the craft files that is. You'll just see things a little bit differently. Maybe the fire will be different coming out of engines if I've modified them with hot rockets. Maybe your clamshell will not be a clamshell, it'll be confetti, but it's still all going to function the same. Alright, so we have just finished a maneuver there that will raise our orbit without disturbing the close approach we had with the space station, which means we don't need that lower stage anymore. We can decouple that, let that float away. In fact, separately, I will switch over to that and deorbit it. In the meantime over here, we need to finish that rendezvous. The station is coming up from behind us now. I'm pretty much navigating by instruments one again. On the left side in my flight computer window, there is a section that says closest approach distance and time to closest approach. And I'm firing up the engines very, very slowly at first, but then ever increasing as I see that that time to closest approach is dropping. As long as it's going down, I know that I can keep throttling up a bit more. If I ever see that it starts going up again, that means that I've slowed down so much relative to my target that I'm actually pushing the close approach off into the distance, which could mean that we'll be getting further away from it once we're slowed down enough that we can begin our maneuvers for docking. And I don't want that to happen. So after eventually throttling to full power when we were only seconds away, a couple seconds away, we then get our relative velocities very small compared to each other, and I can then throttle back down and flip around, face the other way, and head to the station from only 100 meters away. I called this craft my ATV-2. The reason for that is I had started building an ATV, and then realized that it wasn't going to be carrying enough fuel up here, so I wanted to make a bigger one. So this bigger one is what you're seeing here. We'll just dock it up right now and then activate the orange and the regular big tank on my ATV-2 and start the fuel transfer. The ATV-2's tank was not completely full because I knew I pre-calculated how much fuel I was going to want to have on the space station to be able to get to Minmus and circularize. So I have only partially filled the orange tank on there, and most of it will be drained away just in the process of getting over to Minmus. So we will have a bunch of work to do once we have ore coming up there to refine it and repopulate that tank with all kinds of fuel. With the ATV-2's job done, we've decoupled and started our retro burn heading back to Kerbin. This is going to go down and be destroyed, either through the new re-entry heating or worst case scenario when it hits the ground. And in the meantime, what we'll do is go out and start working on the maneuver node that's going to get our station to Minmus. Step 1, of course, is select Minmus at the target. Then we want to zoom in and find either the ascending or the descending node that lines up with Minmus as a tangent. Remember, a tangent is where if you have a line, it intersects a circle only at one point, which means it touches on the edge and doesn't go through the circle at all, touching it on 2 points. It's just 1 point up against the edge of it. Wherever the tangent is that goes through either the ascending or descending node and points at Minmus, that's roughly around where we're going to want to put our maneuver. And if that means we need to warp ahead until Minmus is in a good position to make that happen, that's what we would do. Although in this case, I got lucky, and Minmus just happened to be right on the other end of the tangent with my descending node. So after doing about half of the maneuver that would be necessary to push the prograde out toward Minmus, I then added some inclination change to line my orbit up with Minmus's orbit, and then finished out the prograde pull on that maneuver node until we had the intercept. You know you have it right if your apoapsis on that projected orbit and either your ascending or descending node are both on top of each other, and then both of those are touching the target orbit at exactly where your close approaches are. If you don't have that, you can try doing a little bit of radial maneuver, but it might just mean you need to wait a bit and move your maneuver just a little bit ahead or a little bit behind that ascending or descending node. Okay, so I had noticed that the crew transfer vehicle's engine was still activated previously, so I've disabled that, making sure that the only 2 engines active are the ones on my core module of the Kessler Serenity. And now I am slowly adding acceleration a bit at a time, working my way up from 0 to full throttle, holding my position using the maneuver node button on the left hand of the nav ball, watching for any instability and trying to pay no attention to the debris that is flying past us right there at 300, 200 meters away. Yeah, that looks like about it. It's going to go by at 200 meters. Nothing to see here. Well, nothing to see other than the fact that that mod I'm using that creates engine lights seemed to increase in intensity as I was increasing the throttle, so that was kind of cool to see. It was also cool seeing that I could get it to full power and have it be fairly stable, so I'm maintaining full power here as we continue this burn that pushes this station out to Minmus now. I'll just focus my view over here at Minmus, that way when the orbit gets out here I can see up close whether or not we're coming into the right location. Although the problem is it's a bit wiggly. So I think what I'll do is make another maneuver from halfway there, and hopefully I can get it down a little bit closer to the surface then. Besides, that's where my ascending node is. In fact, that's what I like to do, is make sure that if I can't get my ascending node on the target orbit, then I put it at least halfway so that any maneuvers from that location will be a bit cheaper. So that's what we're doing here. I'll just warp ahead until we get to that maneuver node. See how close we can get it down to the surface this time. Remember, the closer you are to the surface, the cheaper the maneuver is going to be. And by that, I mean the maneuver for getting our capture orbit, our retro burn, once we're at Minmus. So while we wait for this, let's go into the VAB and see what our refuel craft look like. Here is what ATV-1 looked like, but as I said earlier, this was not going to carry enough fuel, so I canceled this idea and we went with ATV number 2. So that's what we have here. Much larger core, much larger side boosters. Originally, I did not have 2 sets of retros on there. You can see I have one here and one up here. Originally, it was only the one at the top, and I found out that that wasn't enough to get it away from the side, so I added the ones at the bottom. Basic lower stage and retros. In this case, I didn't have any RCS down on the bottom engine here because I didn't anticipate a lot of maneuvering before we had decoupled the upper payload, which you can see in here. And this is composed of a couple fairings that were used just for aesthetics. Hiding underneath this fairing here, which is never intended to be decoupled, we have our monopropellant tanks. Hiding down under the bottom fairing right here, we have more monopropellant tanks, as well as some batteries, including a backup battery that's disabled right there just in case, although I really don't anticipate this being in orbit all by itself for very long, even if we didn't put out the solar panels. But those are right there on Action Group 1. And then on Action Group 2, we have the communications antenna right there. There are no other action groups. We have a smaller fuel tank down at the bottom just to transfer stuff around, and then we have the larger one up here which can be used for refueling. I only filled it as much as I needed up on the station to get Kessel Serenity over to Minmus, and I disabled that tank so that nothing would drain out to fuel the engines down here. This was attached to the lower stage with this little sequence here of a probe core so that I could deorbit that stage. I'll take the engine off to make it easier to see here. We have a gyro for just a little bit of control on the lower stage since it didn't have monopropellant and RCS on it. Then we have our decoupler going into a regular old modular girder segment. And then we had the engines all around there and up onto the fuel tank. There's our computer hiding once again with the batteries underneath that inverted fairing. In both cases, I used the technique on the fairing where you don't close it out. So if we delete that fairing and rebuild it, you can see that I just lifted it up like this and then found the right spot that I wanted to turn it blue like that. Clicked, and then we created some sort of interstage style fairings that gave it a nice tapered, sleeker look. And that's pretty much it, except of course for more lights. Oh, and speaking of which, there were two up here that point toward the target for the docking, so yet more lights. We are about to enter the SOI. In fact, there we go. We have the SOI of Minmus now. I just need to orient myself for the capture burn. One thing we want to make sure we're doing here is get that orbit that we will eventually have with our station so that at least part of it will be passing over our landing site. That way there will be a couple opportunities every time around. Because we're passing over the landing site, we could either go down and land there, or if there's a ship that's ready to come back up, we can launch and come back and join our station. Whenever the orbit is not passing over our ground base, we'll just have to keep the warp going and go like that until it is passing over. It's the same thing that we do here on Earth, like anytime we want to go to the ISS, for example, there are launch windows based on when it's passing over the launch site. Well, we'll be doing the same exact thing here. And just like when we left Kerbin, I throttled up a little bit at a time, a little bit. This time I knew it would be really stable though, so I went faster than when I was at Kerbin. That was the first time I had ever gone full power on the engines before. But here, this is the second time, so we know that it's going to be stable. And then after I capture the orbit, I'm going to want to orient this so that the axis of my station goes through the rotation axis of Minmus. Since that makes, if I go out on an EVA, that makes it easier to orient the Kerbal relative to the station on EVA. All of the Kerbals do the same thing. They orient their axis with whatever it is that they're orbiting around. In fact, in a moment here, I am going to go on an EVA just because it's fun. We're going to go out and take a look around, examine the station from the outside, fly all the way to the end of the orange tank, and then fly all the way back again and hop back inside just to prove that we could, if we needed to, go outside and perform any sort of repairs for role-playing purposes. Maybe something's broken. Maybe he'd need to go out and access the refinery from out there. Who knows? Something like that. While Jeb investigates the outside of the station, I'll give you an update on my projects. Since Operation Goldstrike is getting close to done now, that means I'll soon be working on episode 46 of Project Odyssey. I also, as of last night, saw that Nathan Kell is almost ready with RSS. So soon I'll be able to do Alexandrias and Enterprises again as well. Alrighty, we have a base on the ground. We have a station around it. Minmus is ready to be used. Used and abused, but only if we can get our ore carrier, the ferry that will go from the ground to the station, delivering the ore up there for its refining. So that's what we're going to launch now. The very observant of you will see that there's something different about the engine on this one. Even though it is the Mammoth, just like I was launching earlier, two things have changed about it. One is the flame color and size and shape, and the other is the sound. Rather than forcing you to go back and look at it earlier, let me remind you what it used to look like. So this is what it was before. As you can see, the flames were blue, and the sound was completely different. Here, I'll turn it up for you. This is what it used to sound like. But using the Hot Rockets mod, I've changed it to sound like this. I also changed the ignition sound. Now my ignition sounds like this. And as I said, the engine color is now, instead of blue, it's sort of an orangey yellow like fire. So let's flip back to the present time and see what our latest launch looks like again. Look at that thing go, isn't that gorgeous? And there goes the second set of SRBs. I originally had 8 of them on there, but 4 of them had the thrust limited and the others did not. So that meant that the ones without ran their fuel out faster and I dropped them off earlier. The second set with the thrust limiter took longer to drain, and so those are the ones that just dropped off. That allowed me to control my thrust to weight ratio and make sure that I didn't get too high by the time that they were all burning out. It also allowed me to drop them off in pairs to make sure nothing collided on the way down. Even though it's unlikely that they would, it's still just somewhat safer that way. But mostly the purpose was so that I could put my engine to full throttle and know that the thrust to weight would stay in some nominal minimum and maximum bounds for the entire trip from the ground all the way up. Speaking of all the way up, Minmus was on the horizon when we were launching, so we just went straight into the exit burn. However, this time we are going to make an inclination change just a little bit further along in our orbit. If I had wanted to not do that, I would have had to wait for the launch site to come under Minmus's orbit, but I didn't. That would have taken several more revolutions, and I would have had to time up its orbit with our launch site, with the sun being on the launch site and everything. So I just said, let's just go for it. It's not like I don't have the fuel to make the maneuver part way there. You can see the payload now, and you notice it has wheels. It's basically like a little rocket/rover. We'll be landing on the flats near where our drill base is, and then we'll just roll over to it and dock up. But we also have a considerable supply of fuel and some engines so that we can lift the ore off again after we've filled up. When building a rover like this, where you're going to ferry ore up off the surface of something like the moon or Minmus, you have to keep in mind the change in gravity when you're building your craft over in the VAB. If you have some mod that will let you see what the thrust to weight ratio will be like at the location where you'll be, then that can be very handy. In my case, while I was building mine, MechJeb does have a way to switch it into Minmus mode, so I did that to ensure that the thrust to weight would be somewhere in the 1.5 to 2.0 range. Not just for landing, but also for lifting off. When you attach the ore tanks, normally they're going to be empty, so make sure that you check it out with them full. Just drag in some resources, fill up all your tanks, and then check to see what your thrust to weight ratio is like that, and also check your delta V there. If you're in a low orbit around Minmus and you want to land, your tanks are going to be empty, and so you'll need a lot less fuel to do the landing, but lifting back off after you have filled them up is going to be dramatically more fuel. So check in there, fill up the ore tanks, then look at the delta V. Hold that thought for just 1 minute. We're close to landing now, so I've decoupled that stage and we're flying free as the rover. I need to turn on all the tanks. When I activated the engines by hotkey there, they showed as having no fuel because the tanks have been disabled to prevent their fuel from draining down into the engine that was below. But now with that engine decoupled, we can reactivate all those tanks and give our rover access to the fuel now to do its final landing. So getting back to that delta V, make sure you have at least 200. If you want a little buffer, maybe go for 250, and that should be enough to get you back to a low orbit space station. Then remember the amount of delta V it says. If it says 200, 250, whatever, at that point, drag all the ore back out of all of the tanks. Now the number is going to go up, so using the new number, let's say it goes up to 850 or something like that. Using the new number, now add more fuel again to make sure that the difference between what it was, say 850, and the new number is another 200 or 250. That will allow you to do your landing. Speaking of landing, we're almost down to the surface now, and once we get there, I will activate control from here from the docking node that's on the front. That's the one we're going to roll over there to our drill base and hook up. Another thing that you need to remember is to deactivate any strong gyroscopes. They will prevent the rover from rolling anywhere. For just a few seconds, I forgot mine, then I remembered, deactivated it, and then my rover was okay to go. You can see in my flight computer on the side what I was talking about with that Delta V. Notice it's over 900 right now, but once we get over here and dock up, transfer a bunch of ore over, that will drop down quite a bit. As I recall, fully loaded with ore, that'll be about 250 for me. So we're coming in with the Navy Fish docking alignment indicator, which took a little getting used to for it being on the ground. So here we go, all docked up now, and in goes the ore. I could be using my TAC fuel balancer, but I'm simulating a little bit more like what it would be if somebody wanted to use all of these without having any plugins, which just means clicking on the parts and telling it to transfer in or out of whichever tank until everything is all filled up, and then we'll be ready to leave. After undocking, we want to switch to control from here from that probe core that's up on top right under the antenna. That will make it easier to lift off, like in true rocket mode. After that, we go out, check the orbit, select our target space station, and wait until it's passing over the launch site. That may mean waiting several revolutions, but in this case, I got lucky and it was coming over right then. And now, full throttle, up we go, straight toward the station, and that's what we'll be checking in on next time. So until then, I will see you later, Kerbonauts.